Hello everyone, in this video we're going to go through what are data structures. We're going to go through some examples of data structures and how they can be used. So to start off with, asking ourselves what a data structure is, it's like a container that holds data. So the data could be anything. The data could be numbers, the data could be text, the data could be other data structures, or it could be a combination of them all. Now, the next thing that data structures have over, let's say, variables is to have a relationship. So if we think of variables, variables just hold one thing, while with data structures, they can hold many things of the same type of value or of different values. And then they have a relationship with that data. So if I go through an example, it might make a little bit more sense. So when we think of a variable, we can think of a number. For example, in this case, we can have the number 5. We can also have a string. In this case, the string is Ryan. Now, strings can be slightly different depending on what programming language you use. For example, if you use JavaScript, a string is considered a data type. So it fits into this category as a variable. If you use some other programming languages, like if you use C, it's a much lower level language. It doesn't actually consider a string a data type, but it considers a string more as a data structure. And the reason why it defines it as a data structure is to create a string in C, it's comprised of loads of different characters. So if you wanted to create a string in C, you would have a character or, a character Y, a character A, a character N. And these 4 characters would be within an array, and your array would be of size 5 because you need your null operator /0 at the end as your last character to define the end of the string. Then we also have true. So true is a variable. Now, if we look at JavaScript for this example, we can consider our integers, our strings, and our booleans, so our true and false, all as variables. So they are called data types. We have our data types on the left, and then we have our data structures on the right here. So some examples of data structures could be an array or a hash map. And if you've used any arrays before, or you've done a little bit of programming in the past, you'll know that you can add multiple different variables into an array. So in this case, we can add multiple different data types into a data structure. So we could have an array which is of length maybe 3. So this would be an example of an array. We can see that the first element is 9, the second element is 2, and the final element is 5. The main purpose of data structures is to be able to carry data from one source to another, and then to manipulate that data before it gets displayed to a user. So we can think of these data types as containers. So our variables are just containers. So this container here stores 9, this container stores 2, and this container stores 5. Then we can think of a data structure as like a container of containers. So it's just a bigger container that can contain all of our other containers or all of our other variables. So in this example, you can see that we've got one big box and all our variables are contained inside this box. Then if we move on to the next level, our data needs to be stored somewhere. So if we want our data to persist and we don't want it to be deleted when our machine is turned off, we need to store the data somewhere so it will be available for us to use the next time we want to use our machine. So that's where we can store it, in a database. And a database is just somewhere where we can store all this data and all this information. So all our variables and all our data structures can be stored within a database. A database is much more complex, but for now we can just think of it as a place where we can store all the data we want. And the reason we use a database is because when we initially start using variables and data, they're stored in RAM. And RAM on our computer or on our server gets wiped once the machine is powered off, or if the machine crashes, all our data will be lost. So that's why we have to store it in the database. Let's jump into a quick coding example of a data structure. In this example, we're going to use an array. So I'm using JavaScript for this example, and you can see that I've created an array called to-do list. And in my to-do list, I have 3 different items that I have to do. I have to put the bin out, I have to go to work, and I have to go to the gym. So if I want to print out all these different items, I need to go and loop through them. So I'm using a for each method. For each is a built-in method to all array objects in JavaScript. So if I go and run this, we'll see put the bin out, go to work, and gym displayed in order. So we can see that it's displayed in order. We can see put the bin out, go to work, and gym are displayed in the same order that they're defined in this array. Now, if this syntax here is confusing you, we can also do this using a basic for loop. So if I just get rid of this and I simply say for, and I'll do a normal for loop, so I'll define my incrementer, let I equal 0, and then we want to loop through the array, so we're going to go for I is less than the array, so the array is to do list dot length, which is an inbuilt method, and then we will increment the incrementer. So then inside this for loop, we want to go and print out or console log all our items. So console.log, and we'll say to-do list. Position will depend on where we are in the for loop, so we'll put in I here. So you'll see if we run this, we'll get the exact same output. And you can see we get the exact same output. Now, if you're wondering how this actually works in like a real application, our database would be this line here. So if we have data in our database that might be stored in an array, or it might be stored in a table actually, but we can think of this data as being stored in our database. So put out bin, go to work, and gym will be stored in our database. We will be getting this information from the database to our application. And what I mean by application is it could be initially going to like a server. So the server would maybe do this work here, and the server might then send this information to the front end, and the front end would maybe display this information in a better manner. But in this example, we can see that if we look at our terminal, we can just see the outputs. Put the bin out, go to work, and gym. If it was in a graphical user interface, it would be, much prettier. You could put a little icon of a bin beside it, which would mean you could delete the item, or maybe you could click on the item, and when you clicked on the item, it put a line through the item so you'd know that it's done or it's finished. You might even have a counter that would track how many items you have, and while you cross out an item, your counter decrements by 1. You could do all sorts of things, but this is just a basic example. So if we go back to our diagram, we can see this is the flow. So we start off with our database, we've got our data that we want in there. Then on our server, we have a program running. On this server, we're connected to the database so we can get all the data we want. Then with our server, we can create an API, and this API will just serve up the specific data that we want. So for that previous example, our data would be our to-do lists. Then that API would then be called by the front end. So the front end could be, a JavaScript or a JavaScript framework, and then that would be then served up to the user. So that's what the user would see. So the user would then see on their browser their list of to-do items and everything else. So I hope this video gave you a little bit of a better idea of what a data structure is and how a data structure is used in a web application. We briefly touched on arrays in this video. We'll be going into detail more in the next video. If you like this type of content, give the video a like and subscribe for future content.